B'ezrat Hashem, today in Masechet Shabbat, we're going to start Gimel Amud Bet towards the top of the page Amar Abaye. Needs a little bit of an introduction for today, B'ezrat Hashem. Gimel Amud Bet Chevra. 2 dots. It's about 6-7 lines from the top of the page, maybe 8 lines. 2, 4, 6, 8 lines from the top of Gimel Amud Bet. Okay, Chevra, in Hilchot Shabbat, we have 4 Rishuyot. Okay? What are the 4 Rishuyot? So the Deoraita Rishuyot are Rishut Rabim, Rishut Yachid. That's easy. Okay? Now, just to know, it is worthwhile to note, there's certain halachot that determine something as being either Rishut Rabim or Rishut Yachid. So for example, in order to be Rishut Yachid, it has to be 4 by 4 tefachim with a 10 tefach wall surrounding. We'll get more into this later, but let's just keep the idea. There's certain numbers that define something as Rishut Yachid. To be Rishut Rabim, it has to be a pathway that's 16 amot, surrounds the city. There's certain halachot about it. Some say that 600,000 people have to pass through there. There's certain halachot, but this is Deoraita. We have Rishut Rabim, Rishut Yachid. Now what are the 2 other Rishuyot?
Karmilis.
So before we get to karmilis, let's talk about Mekom Petul. What is Mekom Petul? Mekom Petul is something that is not Rishut Rabim and it's not Rishut Yachid. So this is something that Midoraita, no problem. If Midrabanan, you should be allowed to move something from that to Rishut Rabim or that to Rishut Yachid, because this is not considered like it sounds, Mekom Petul. That's what it is. It's a place that's not Rishut Rabim, not Rishut Yachid, and therefore you could move something from it to both Rishut Rabim or Rishut Yachid.
Why do you make a roof?
So hold on the question with that, before that. But there's a 4th thing with Yochai, which Yochai just mentioned, was called karmilit. Now karmilit is a special rabbinic reshut. It's a reshut d'Rabbanan, we could call it, which is where they said that there's isur actually to move from it, midrabanan, from it to Rishut Yachid, to Rishut Rabim. It's considered more of a isu. So Mekom Petul is like general, something that's not Rishut Rabim, Rishut Yachid. Karmilit is a specific Zera d'Rabbanan, Isu d'Rabbanan, to carry from specific locations that are determined, not Rishut Rabim or Yachid, but still Asur d'Rabbanan to carry from it to public or private domain. Karmilit is essentially anything that's not Rishut Rabim, Rishut Yachid should be Mekom Petul. And being that it's Mekom Petur, you should be allowed to carry from Mekom Petur to Rishut Yachid to Rishut Rabim.
What's the difference between Karmilit and Mekom Petur?
So there were certain types of Mekom Petur that the rabbis came along and they said, this area that otherwise should be mutar, we're making special gezeirah here, it's asur midrabanan, it's called Karmilit. Okay, we'll get more into the Masechta later, the specific examples why they would asur in certain cases, but the main point over here is, to carry from Rishut Rabim to Yachid is asur d'Oraita. From Karmilit to Rishut Rabim or Rishut Yachid is asur midrabanan. That's a rabbinic type issue. Okay, so far so good. Now we had in our Mishnah, we said that there were these cases where someone picks something up, extends his hand, puts it into the other property. So listen to what Abaye is going to say. He's first going to say something that is clear, and then he's going to ask a question based on that. What is the status of the hand? What is the status of yad? Is the yad considered Rishut Rabim or Rishut Yachid? So he's going to say, I'll prove to you it's neither. Why is it neither? I'll prove it. Let's listen to the proof that he's going to say. Let's take the case we had before. You're the balabayit, I'm the ani. I'm standing outside, I pick something up, I extend my hand inside. And you take it from me and put it down. So what's the halacha in that case?
Both of you not
Turim. Beautiful, excellent.
So this is a proof that it's not a reshut, because it was a reshut, he carry oker mincha v'meniach etzlo, אז כאילו עשה מלאכה.
If this is considered Rishut Rabim because I'm standing outside,
there is no difference.
You picked up from Rishut Rabim and you put down Rishut Yachid, you should be chayav. It can't be Rishut Rabim. Now let's flip the case.
Because hold on. Keep it on the same reshut.
You hear the point. If it's considered Rishut Rabim because I'm standing in Rishut Rabim, so you picked it up from Rishut Rabim and you put it down, you're chayav. And the other, so it's not Reshut Harabim. And let's go the other way. If you picked something up and you put it outside and I took it and put it down, if it's Reshut Hayachid, I picked it up and I put it down, I should be Chayav, but we're both Patur. So says Abaye, you see clearly the Yad is not considered Reshut Harabim or Reshut Hayachid. So what is it? So now his question is going to be, do we say it's considered Makom Petur, or do we say there's a Isur D'Rabbanan, it's a karmilit? Lemay nafka mina? What's the nafka mina? This is a very interesting question. I don't know if you thought about this yet. Someone asked me this in the other shoe, I think. Can you pull your hand back in and put it down?
What do you mean?
You put your hand outside to give me something, okay? Oh, I did something wrong. So you want to pull your hand back in and put it down in Reshut Hayachid.
You grab something?
You picked something up, Reshut Hayachid. You put your hand through the door and you wanted to pass it to me. I said, oh, I made a mistake. Shogeg.
You did Akira, but you did not Anacha.
So you did Akira, Reshut Hayachid, you put your hand through and now you want to pull your hand back inside and put it down.
No?
Hold on. If your hand is considered Makom Petur, so what should be the halacha?
That the person is Patu.
No problem.
Pull your hand back inside and put it down.
No problem.
But if your hand is considered karmilit, so what's the problem? Now you're doing an akira from karmilit and a hanacha in Reshut Hayachid, and that's a sur midrabanan. So Abaye's question is going to be, I know it's not Reshut Harabim or Reshut Hayachid, but is the hand considered Makom Petur, or is the hand considered karmilit? If it's considered Makom Petur, pull your hand back inside and put it down, and you saved yourself. To a certain, initially you did something that's asur, but you saved yourself. Okay. But if it's considered karmilit, to put it back, pull your hand back inside and put it down, now is an isur d'Rabbanan. You're not allowed to do that. Not allowed to do that.
Not isur d'Oraita?
Oh no, because from
karmilit.
No, because from karmilit to Reshut Hayachid is only asur d'Rabbanan, but it's still asur.
אבל דאורייתא זה רק אם עקרת והנחת מרשות אחרת. זה כפול מה שאמרנו אתמול, שזה ממש עקירה מרשות, מעביר לרשות אחרת, כי רבים ויחיד מניח את זה.
בזמן שזה עובר זה ברשות השנייה כבר.
So that's, but what reshut is it? It's in your hand. So if you look at your hand as Makom Petur, pull your hand back in and put it down. If it's considered karmilit, so you have Yisod D'Rabbanan to put it back down in Reshut Hayachid.
As long as it didn't land on land?
This is his question, yes. So what's going to happen is, Abai is going to ask this question, and then we're going to have two braitaot that seem to paskin. One says you could put it back in, the other one says you can't. So we're going to say, it's a machloket tanaim. Is it karmilit or is it...
But the both said it's karmilit or one of said it's...
That's going to be the proof. So we're going to try to say, one holds it's not karmilit and it's mutar to put it back in, and one holds it is, and that's why... And then we're going to have 5 pirchot to that. We're going to say 5 different ways of explaining how we know how it's not a answer to Abaye's question, because really the braitaot are discussing something else. That's what we're going to do today. That'll be the sugya today. Can you close the door, Yochai? Bakasha. For that. Okay, everybody hear what we're doing today? Let's see this inside. It's very interesting. You see how the Chachamim...
bring 2 brayatot, they look like one of them says Reshut Harabim. Then a fat pirchot,
it's not a proof. זה לא ראיה.
וזה בכלל לא היה מדובר על אותו נושא.
Exactly. So let's see. It's very interesting.
זה גימל איפה?
Like the obvious situation with the bag, that you put a bag on it, or if you're just giving the hand, if you consider like, you know, with Rabbi Chia and Rav and Rabbi.
Is a bag.
That you're bringing basically a braita that's not related to the situation.
Fine, right. That was the previous sugya, right. Amar Abaye, says Abaye, Pshitali, it's obvious to me, Yado shel Adam, the hand of a person, Eina lo kirshut harabim, velo kirshut hayachid. It's not the public property, it's not private property. Why? How do I know? Kirshut harabim lo damya, I know it's not Reshut Harabim miyado da'ani, from the case of the ani, because when the ani put his hand inside and the balabayit takes the food, balabayit is not chayav. If the hand is Reshut Harabim, balabayit should be chayav. Obviously, it's not Reshut Harabim. But I also know Kirshut Hayachid lo damya, it's not considered Reshut Hayachid miyado de balabayit, from the case of the hand of the balabayit. When he puts his hand outside and I take from it, I'm not chayav, I took from his hand. Obviously, his hand is not Reshut Hayachid. So says Abaye, it's obvious to me from the Mishnah's cases that the hand is not Reshut Harabim and it's not Reshut Hayachid. It's not one of the Reshuyot D'Oraita, that's for sure. But Abaye, based on that, Abaye asked the following Sheila. Yado shel Adam, ma'u sheteasek karmelit. is the hand of a person made by the Chachamim like a karmilit, like one of the Rishuyot D'Rabanan, that would be asur to take from it to Rishut Yachid or to Rishut Harabim. Mi kansur Rabbanan la'ahadure legabe. Did the rabbis kansur give him a knas, a penalty? Did they give him a penalty to return his hand back inside? Let's just illustrate. Balabayit picked up food, put it outside. If you say it's a karmilit, that's a penalty. You can't put your hand back inside and put it down, because then you're transferring akira from your hand, karmilit, putting it down into Rishut Yachid, which is asur, D'Rabanan. Or lo, or maybe they didn't. It's considered a mekom petur, and therefore you could pull your hand back inside and put it back down, and that shouldn't be a problem. Everybody hear the sheila. It's a fascinating question. You see how the rabbis analyze every detail over here. What's the status of your hand? Amazing, amazing question. So Tashma, let's bring a proof. The Braita says, there's two Braitaot. So Tashma. The Braita says, if a person's hand was full of fruits, Tashma, if a person's hand was full of fruits, and he put his hand outside, so he was standing in Bishut Yachid. He stretched his hand outside, and now it's hovering above a public area. And he stretched his hand outside. So Tanicha, the one Braita teaches, he's not allowed to return it. Now what does that Braita seem to hold?
It seems like it's a
karmilit. Beautiful. But there's another Braita that teaches, you are allowed to return it to the Rishut Yachid. So it seems to be it's not a karmilit, it's a mekom petur. So my love, says the Gemara, isn't it logical? This is the machloket between the two Braitaot. Dimar Savar, the first Braita that says you're not allowed to return your hand inside.
Second one.
The first. The first Braita that says asur lachzira, you're not allowed to return it, holds your hand is like karmilit. So it would be a problem of Isur D'Rabanan to put it back into your Rishut Yachid. Good question. I'll get to that in a minute. That's a very good question. What do you do? Umar Savar, and the other one who holds that it's mutar lachzira, lav ke karmilit dami. It's not the karmilit, it's mekom petur. So to put it back down into Rishut Yachid, mutar. That's why it's permitted. So what we've just done is we've resolved his question by showing it's a machloket tanaim. Your question actually is a machloket tanaim. Beautiful. Now Matan's asking, what do you do? Let's say you hold it's like karmilit. So what do?
You can't put it down.
So what we're going to see later, if you hold it's karmilit, it's a problem to return it. So then logically you should have to keep your hand out there
until the end of
the
Shabbat.
Entire Shabbat.
Right, because
that's what you're stuck doing.
If you do anacha, it's the
that's what you're stuck doing. Because if you do anacha, you did akira b'shut hayachid, and then anacha b'shut harabim. To pull it back in is isur d'Rabanan. So therefore, what are you going to have to do if you hold it's considered karmilit?
Unless somebody comes,
you're going to get tired. That's what's going to happen.
Come and pull it from your hand.
Now look, here, listen to this. I was going to mention this later, but I'll mention it now. If your hand is so tired that you accidentally drop it, you're not going to be chayav actually. The concern would be that you might put it down while you're getting tired. Right? Otherwise, it's an honest, whatever it is. Your hand's so tired you couldn't do anything about it. But if you put it down, that would be an isur d'oraita now. Okay, everybody hear what's going on. But what we've just resolved is, it sounds like from the two Braitaot that seem to be arguing, the she'elav Abaye is a machloket tanaim.
But if he's still following an isur, he's passing an isur once he just push his hand out, right? He put his hand outside.
Yeah.
If you bring it back, it's isur d'Rabanan, right? So what's the difference? He already passed the isur.
He didn't do anything. Oh, what do you mean?
In the karmilit.
Yeah.
This is the fence, right? The border.
Yeah.
And the hand is here.
Yeah. So you weren't supposed to.
If you bring it back,
you were not supposed to.
This is isur.
So no. Well, while you're holding it there, you're not doing another isur.
As long as it brings.
You're not doing another isur.
But if
you pull it back in, it's another isur.
D'Rabanan.
So either you're going to do an isur d'oraita by putting it down, isur d'Rabanan by pulling it back in. But either way, you can't move. That would be the simple understanding.
Why? If you can't move.
Too bad. Stay there for the rest of Shabbat. You'll eat the cholent standing up. What can I tell you?
He passed just one isur.
If you don't move, yeah. So look, says the Gemara, no. Now listen, Chevra. Everyone has to focus in well here today because we're going to have 5 pirchot now. This gets confusing. There's a lot of halachot we're about to discuss. Yes. So the Gemara says 5 pirchot now. Now what we're going to do with these 5 pirchot is to say this is not necessarily the machloket Tanaim. Meaning we're assuming, what is the machloket Tanaim? If the hand is karmilit or not karmilit. No, that's not necessarily what the Tanaim are arguing about. Okay? So now we have to figure out, well then what are they arguing about? And we'll have 5 explanations. Lo. Says the Gemara, lo. No. That's not the machloket, and you can't answer Abaye's question with this machloket. And now the first way we're going to go is like this. Really, both Braitaot could hold that it is like a karmilit. Your hand is like a karmilit. Okay, well, let's stop for a second. If your hand is like a karmilit, I understand why it would be asur to bring your hand back in. But why would the second Braita then say, it's mutar lachzira? That's isur d'Rabanan. So if both Braitaot hold that it's like a karmilit, it should for sure be asur to bring it back in. Why would the second Braita say it's mutar?
In case the ani is trying to give something to Dashir?
Oh, no, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about where you put, let's just stick with one case. The lo kashya. The Gemara says, no, this is not a question. Kan lemata me'asara, did you place your hand within 10 tfachim of the ground outside? Kan lemala me'asara. And this is when you did not place your hand 10 tfachim outside. Let me explain. Really, to be considered part of the Reshut Harabim, it has to be within 10 tfachim of the ground. So like this. If you stretched your hand outside, the first Braita says, and it's within 10 tefach of the ground. So you already did an akira from the Reshut HaYachid, and you extended your hand into Reshut Harabim, which is something that already is at least asur midrabanan. There the rabbis penalty, knas. Now what's going to happen is your hand is a karmilit. To bring it back in, you're not allowed to do. But if it's above that, it's in the avir of the Reshut Harabim, the airspace of the Reshut Harabim, that's not yet considered really in the Reshut Harabim. The rabbis were lenient. Even though your hand should be like karmilit, you could bring your hand back inside.
Like basketball, you touch the line or don't touch the line.
But we therefore are saying is both Braitaot could hold your hand as like karmilit. It's just if it's above, it's a mekom petur essentially, you could bring your hand back in.
Beautiful.
Pircha number 1. Okay, that's easy. Let's continue. The Ibaitema, now this gets very interesting. The Ibaitema is Pircha number 2. Really, both Braitaot is when you stretched your hand outside and it was within 10 tefach of the ground. So now, you have a problem, right? Oh. Vilav ke karmilit damya, and both Braitaot actually hold your hand is not considered karmilit. Okay? So, a person stretched, the Balabait extended his hand outside within 10 tefach of the ground, but his hand is not like a karmilit. Both Braitaot agree upon that issue. Velo kashya, but there's no problem. Kan mi ba'od yom. He stretched his hand outside Friday evening at 5:55. Why was he doing this? Because he's a funny person. And he held his hand outside from 5:55 to 6 o'clock, and 6 o'clock was Shabbat. Now, really, before Shabbat, he should have brought his hand back in because he's creating a problem here. Okay. But, says the Gemara, that's when the second Braita says, really, at the point that Shabbat hit, you didn't do anything asur be'etzem, other than the fact you should have brought your hand in before Shabbat. So there the second Braita says you could put your hand back in. Kan mishachashecha. The first Braita that says it's asur to return your hand is when you stretched your hand outside when it's already Shabbat. So now you've done something that's wrong. Since you're doing something that's wrong, the rabbis will say, and listen to this, a very important chiluk, we're not saying it's like a karmilit, but it's a direct knas against you. You can't put your hand back inside. We're saying both Braitaot hold your hand is not like a karmilit. The question is, will they give you a direct penalty?
But if it's not the karmilit, the first opinion, so what's the point to say you put it before shechashcha?
Oh, it's not karmilit, but still, if you do something, you start off some sort of an isur by stretching it outside, we're not going to give you the leniency. We're going to give a penalty to you. It's not. It's within 10 tefachim. It's not like a karmilit, but at the same time, they're going to give you a direct penalty. You did it on Shabbat, you can't bring your hand back in. You did it before Shabbat, you should have brought your hand in before Shabbat, but we're not going to give you a direct penalty like that. You could bring your hand back in.
So both say no karmilit, one say before Shabbat, one say after Shabbat.
Exactly. Mi ba'od yom, the Gemara explains. If he stretched his hand when it was Friday, so lo kansor rabbanan, they didn't give him a direct penalty, you could put your hand back in. Mishachashecha, but if it's already Shabbat and you stretched your hand outside, kansor rabbanan, they gave him a penalty. Again, it's not that it's a karmilit, but they give him penalty, you can't bring your hand back in. Now listen to this next step outside for a second. This gets very interesting over here. The Gemara is going to say, what are we saying now? If he stretched his hand outside before Shabbat, he could bring his hand back in. If he stretched his hand outside on Shabbat, cannot bring his hand back in. So they give him a penalty when he did something wrong on Shabbat. If he did it before, he's not going to get that penalty. Okay, everybody hear that? The Gemara is going to say it should be exactly the opposite. It's a challenge. The Gemara is about to ask a very strong question. Really, the logic should show the exact opposite way. Because think about this for a second. The guy who stretched his hand outside before Shabbat, let's say he puts that item down in Reshut HaRabim. Has he done an Isur D'Oraita?
No, before Shabbat.
Has he done an Isur? He puts it down on Shabbat.
On Shabbat, but
he stretched his hand out before Shabbat, and he puts it down on Shabbat. It's not an Isur D'Oraita. It's an Isur D'Abanan of Anacha B'Reshut HaRabim, fine, but it's something wrong. Is it an Isur D'Oraita? No.
No.
But the person who stretched out his hand on Shabbat, if he puts it down in Reshut HaRabim, so says the Gemara, the logic should be exactly the opposite. The guy, listen, what? Because the person who stretched his hand out before Shabbat, we're not worried that such a person is going to do an Isur D'Oraita. So there we should say, you have to continue holding that item the entire Shabbat. Why? What? Because worse comes to worse, he's going to put it down. Is he chayav d'oraita? No. But the person who on Shabbat stretched his hand out, if he gets tired and eventually puts down this item, what's going to happen? It's chayav d'oraita. So what we should not create a isur d'rabanan on that person.
Why?
We should say, because what we should say then is, so that you don't transgress an isur d'oraita, we shouldn't level an isur d'rabanan against you. So says the Gemara, ivcha v'stavra. It might have been that he did something worse initially in the beginning, but practically speaking, you want to save him from an isur d'oraita. So maybe where he stretches his hand on Shabbat, otherwise he's going to put it down, it'll be chayav midoraita. We should not send isur d'rabanan against him. Whereas if he stretches it out before Shabbat, so that he remembers in the future not to do funny business, we should level an isur d'rabanan against him.
What's the logic on that? I don't understand. I'm sorry.
What's that?
No. Why if he would come to make an isur d'oraita, we don't want to give him a knas?
This is a person who did something wrong in the beginning. We know that, right? Mm-hmm. We know that. Right? What are you asking? What's your question?
My question is, why is the logic that a person who is about to do the oraita, we don't want to punish him with a knas, but a person who did the rabanan, we want to punish him with a knas? The ifcha mistabra, how is that mistabra?
Listen. If we allow you to pull your hand back in, what have you done?
What do you mean?
But
nothing.
It's not nothing. Exactly.
No, you didn't
so why don't we allow... No, we're saying it's... These shittot are now saying it's not a karmilis. So allow the guy to pull his hand back in so that he doesn't end up doing an isur d'oraita. But if he put his hand out before Shabbat, he's not going to do an isur d'oraita. So give him a penalty so that he knows for future Shabbatot that 5:55 in the afternoon, he shouldn't start doing funny business. And therefore, you'll save him from doing things asur in the future. A worst comes to worst, he puts it down on Shabbat. It's isur d'rabanan maximum, not isur d'oraita. Okay. So the question the Gemara is asking really is, level the penalty against the person who is not going to ultimately perhaps do an isur d'oraita. You make this guy hold the item outside, when he put it outside on Shabbat, the whole Shabbat, he might eventually put it down, and then it'll be chayav midoraita. So don't give him a knas there, let him put it back in. Which means this is all knas d'rabanan. So don't give him the penalty. Instead, say, bring it back inside. And the guy who put it outside before Shabbat, worst comes to worst. Exactly, worst comes to worst. He puts, okay, it's isur d'rabanan, but at least he hasn't done an isur d'oraita. So there, maybe you should give him a knas. But the guy who put it outside on Shabbat, don't give him a knas, because if you give him this knas, he'll perhaps end up doing an isur d'oraita by putting it down.
How?
Because he did a kira in Reshut HaYachid.
No, but how? Why if you give him knas, am I going to do isur d'oraita?
No, if you don't give him the knas.
What's the knas? No, because what's the knas? Because what's the knas? You can't bring it back in. So what's going to happen? He'll have to put it down outside eventually.
Give him a knas. You're going to help him to prevent Isur D'Oraita. Chazak. Yefeh.
You understand? Beautiful. By giving him the knas, you are now making it that he has to keep his hand outside. Now he'll put it down and it'll be Chayav D'Oraita. So if Chamistaver, the opposite is logical, says the Gemara. Very interesting question.
But if he motzi his hand, only one thing I don't understand. If he motzi his hand,
we have a lot to get through still, Chavim.
If he push his hand outside from the reshut to reshut before Shabbat, before Shabbat,
yes,
and then he kept his hand there,
yes,
there is no otzah here, right?
Exactly. So worst comes to worst, he puts it down. He did hanacha,
but only one. But the hand is still outside.
Exactly.
So how come that there is otzah here?
So that's the point. That's the point. He's not. You're right. He's not doing an Isur D'Oraita for sure. We know that.
Chachamim worry about the one that he can end up doing Isur D'Oraita.
So you understand?
Shema is going to end up
the one is
pushing something in Shabbat.
You're right. The chashash is much less significant. Exactly. That's the question.
What I'm thinking to he's not doing nothing at this point. Exactly. The hand is already outside.
So let's read that inside now. Adarabba says the Gemara, the opposite is logical. Mi be'od yom, when he stretched his hand out on Friday, let's say he ultimately puts it down in the Reshut Harabim. Lo ati lidei chiyuv chatat. He won't be chayav midoraita because he stretched his hand out before Shabbat. It wasn't akira and anacha. He put it down on Shabbat, but he stretched it out before Shabbat.
Knas, tell knas.
So leknesei Rabbanan, let the Rabbanan there give him a knas. He has to keep holding it. But if he stretched his hand out when it's already Shabbat, that if he puts it down, he will be chayav midoraita. So lo leknesu Rabbanan. The rabbis should not give him. Let him bring it back in. So at least he's over D'Rabbanan, but not D'Oraita. Well, they didn't do this. We'll see. That's the question. We just made the second pircha we said is that the braita that allows you. It's a very good question, but the point is we just finished saying that the braita that allows you to bring it back in is where you stretch it out before Shabbat. Is where you stretched it out before Shabbat. The braita that does not allow you to is where you stretched it out on Shabbat. So asks the Gemara, but logically, the Isurim, when you stretched it out on Shabbat, are worse. You're going to lead to an Isur D'Oraita. So why would you answer the other way? Say that the Braita that allows you to bring it back in is when you stretched it out on Shabbat, and the one that does not allow you to bring it back in is when you stretched it out before Shabbat. And the Gemara is going to draw a conclusion. Okay, I hear. You're saying it's assisting him in the thing that he did wrong in the first place. But before we get there, Chevra, the Gemara is going to say the fact that we don't answer this way, we don't give the Ipcha Mistavra, even though it is Mistavra.
Why?
It shows us that we can answer a question of Rav Bibi Bar Abaye. Bear with me, Chevra. Rav Bibi Bar Abaye has a different question. Abaye's son happens to be Rav Bibi. Rav Bibi Bar Abaye asked a different question. Really, let me just point out what this shows us. What does this show you? We don't follow this Ipcha Mistavra. So we seem to be saying, listen to what comes out. Chachamim said, we will give you a Isur D'Rabbanan, even though that could lead to an Isur D'Oraita.
Again.
The Chachamim are saying, we will give you an Isur D'Rabbanan, even though it may lead to an Isur D'Oraita. The way we answered, and not like the Ipcha Mistavra.
You have to keep his hand.
Exactly. The guy who stretched his hand out on Shabbat has to keep it there, the Isur D'Rabbanan, and even though this could lead to him putting it down, which is an Isur D'Oraita.
If he drop it?
If he puts it down. If he drops it, we said, if it's an honest, he's exempt. But if he puts it down, he's Chayav Midoraita. So what the Gemara therefore is saying is, the fact that we don't answer like Ipcha Mistavra shows us that we uphold the Isurim D'Rabbanan, even if that could potentially lead to something worse. Now Rabbi Bar Abaye asked the question about that. Let me tell you the question, and the Gemara is going to say the fact that we're answering the Braitaot this way would answer his question too. Back in the day when they baked bread in an oven, it wasn't on racks like we have today. It was basically, let's imagine like an A or something like that and they would stick the bread on the sides of the oven. Now to bake on Shabbat, Asur D'Oraita, we know Av Melacha, right? What about if the bread was baked already and it was still stuck to the sides of the oven? Ridiyat hapat. What does that mean? Removing it from the sides of the oven.
They're not allowed it.
It's not an Isur D'Oraita, but it is an Isur D'Rabbanan. Now, why is it an Isur D'Rabbanan on the side? The reason, first of all, sorry, it's not Isur D'Oraita because it's not a Melacha, it's called a Chokhmah. But I'm not going to get into that. But it's not an Isur D'Oraita. But it is an Isur D'Rabbanan, either because if we allow you to take the bread off on Shabbat, you might end up baking. So it's a Gzera etu a D'Oraita. Or what's the other issue? The other issue is it's Uvda Dechol. It's considered behaviors that are weekday behaviors, not allowed to do that on Shabbat. It's Isur D'Rabbanan across the board.
But if you want to eat the bread.
Let's hold off on the question now. Let's focus. This is complicated. So, to remove the bread from the side of the oven on Shabbat is Isur D'Rabbanan. Okay? Now, Rabbi Bar Abai asked the following question. This is a fascinating question. A guy forgot it was Shabbat. Let's just take the case of Shogeg. And he put bread on the side of the oven. Now, it's starting to bake. Now, he has not done the Av Melacha of Ofeh. He hasn't done baking yet, so he wants to remove it from the oven on Shabbat.
But there is no bishul achar bishul, or afi achar.
Don't stick us to focus. I don't know. If he lets the bread to continue to bake, what's going to happen? Isur D'Oraita. If he removes it now, what is he doing? He's saving himself from an Isur D'Oraita by doing
Isur D'Rabbanan.
So Rabbi Bar Abai asked a fascinating question. Is he allowed to remove the bread that he put on the side of the oven on Shabbat, that he put on Shabbat, to save himself from an Isur D'Oraita by performing an Isur D'Rabbanan?
But it's anyway going to lead to something else.
זאת אומרת, תציל אותו, תמשוך את הלחם שלו, יהיה אפוי כבר ואז אתה ממש חייב, כי הוא בדרך להפות אותו. הכניס אותו לתנור, זה process.
But it seems like we're going to end up...
בהלכה אומר שנראה לי אסור לבדוק אותו.
Let's not get to the halakha first. No. חבר'ה, listen, what's the point?
נראה שכאילו אתה תהפוך, אתה תגיע למצב שאתה מזלזל באיסורי דרבנן בשביל לא לעבור...
So what are we saying here?
So you're not going to remove this.
Says the Gemara, beautiful. Matan understands the proof. The fact that we're saying over here, the guy who stretched out his hand on Shabbat, we give him a knas d'Rabbanan, even though it can lead to the Isur D'Oraita of putting it down. So this is a proof to Rav Bibi Bar Abaye's question that in such a case, we're going to say, you can't remove it from the oven. It's an Isur D'Rabbanan. We're going to enforce the Isur D'Rabbanan, even though you're going to lead to an Isur D'Oraita. So we answered Rav Bibi Bar Abaye's question with the second pircha that we're giving in the Braitaot. Everybody with me?
Yeah.
Amazing. Let's read that inside. Again, we're not making it. That's what it seems to be. Let's see that inside, Chevra. Let's see. Says the Gemara. The fact that we're not answering like this Ibcha Mistavra, we're not giving that answer. Rather, we're saying where he stretches his hand on Shabbat, he cannot bring it back in. And he's doing an Isur D'Rabbanan. We're going to say it's an Isur D'Rabbanan, and you can't bring it back in, even though it could lead to Isur D'Oraita. Tipshot Rabbi Bar Abaye. So this could answer a question of Rav Bibi Bar Abaye. Debai Rabbi Bar Abaye, because Rabbi Bar Abaye asked the following question. He said like this: Idvik pat bitanor. If a person accidentally or intentionally, either way, he stuck bread in an oven on Shabbat. Hitiru lo lerdota kodem sheyavo lidei chiyuv chatat. Do the Chachamim allow him to remove it from the oven, which is an Isur D'Rabbanan, before it bakes, so that he's not over an Isur D'Oraita? Or maybe not. Lo itiru. They don't allow him. They enforce the D'Rabbanan, even though it leads to the Av Melacha of baking. So the Gemara says, Tipshut, we could answer this. Deloi tiru. You see, we don't allow you to bring your hand back in, even though you'll put it down, which is an Isur D'Oraita. We're not mekil on an Isur D'Rabbanan to prevent an Isur D'Oraita. Beautiful. Now what the Gemara is going to do is to say, okay, it's true. Halo kashya, this is not a problem. Enachinami. It is a proof. Meaning the Gemara says, the way we answered, that you can't bring your hand back in this second pircha, this is a proof that the Rabbanan will enforce their halakha d'Rabbanan, even if it leads to an Isur D'Oraita. Okay, 1 second. And the same thing will be, Raviva, you cannot take the bread off the oven, even though it leads to an Isur D'Oraita. Now, what do you want to say, Chilu?
Because by putting the bread for sure, you're going to make it.
Excellent, Yochai.
זה כבר process.
No,
שמת את הלחם,
מה שאין כן?
שהוא עושה את היד, maybe you hold it.
Oh, beautiful, excellent, amazing. Rashi Mamish says it's beautiful, excellent. So it's not הוכחה, beautiful, excellent.
שמת את הברד בתנור, לא, זה מה שאמרנו, זה לא הוכחה. שמת את הברד בתנור, זה עניין של זמן, חס ושלום שאתה עובר דאורייתא. זה לא יעזור לך.
אני מבין.
בלי שאלה.
אבל העניין הוא שאתה תבוא פה למצב שאתה עובר איסורי דרבנן בשביל לא לעבור איסור דאורייתא. אז הם לא יקל, זה לא הוכח, אתה לא יכול פה להשוות בין שתי הסיטואציות.
כן, נו.
זה מה
שהוא אומר. You can compare between both situations, that's what I'm saying.
Why do you
think in this situation they are not going to be mekilim, and in this situation they're going to be
mekilim?
Because you're going to end up, is going to be meniach in it anyway. Whose person going to end up?
בלחם
It's going to give you the whole Shabbat?
בלחם שמת את הברד?
לא.
It's about time, 10-15 minutes, בום, דאורייתא, להפית אותו. בהוצאה של היד, לא, אתה יכול להחזיק את זה.
כן.
יכול להיות.
יש מצב שבן אדם חזק.
הוא יצטער אבל גם.
אפילו, או שנפל לו, אז זה לא יהיה זה, אבל בלחם שמת, נגעת, נסעת, זהו. הלחם הזה יהיה אפוי והבן אדם עבר את הדאורייתא.
אתה רוצה להגיד לי עדיף שיוציא את זה עכשיו?
לא, זה מה שאמרו, אפילו כל זה ולא התירו לו. אתה לא תעשי איסור דרבנן כדי להציל את הלחם, תלמד. אז אי אפשר להשוות את שני המקרים. זה הפריחה.
So anyway, we know that the bread is assured.
We're going to see in a minute, Rashi speaks this out, I'll explain, yeah.
We're not removing the bread.
What we're saying is, I'm not saying halakha l'maaseh. Let's stay with the Gemara because we still have to go through a few more steps. But the point is, from the second pircha, we said in the Braitaot, we could answer Rav Bibi Bar Abaye's question. You can't bring your hand back in when you put it out on Shabbat, which means Chachamim said a gzeira against you, even though it will lead to it could lead to Isur D'Oraita. So here too, when you put the bread in on Shabbat, even though it will lead to Isur D'Oraita, you can't take it off. Okay? And the Gemara says, yes, that's a proof. That would be the proof.
So it is a proof.
It is a proof. But now
so you don't remove the bread and you don't bring back your hand.
In the second pircha, it is a proof. What the Gemara is about to do is to say, it's not necessarily a proof, because I'll give you a third pircha, another way to explain the two braitaot we brought above that don't necessarily connect with Rabbi Bibi Bar Abaye's question. Okay, so let's see it now. I'll give you a third pircha, le'olam lo tipshot. Really, you cannot answer the question of Rabbi Bibi Bar Abaye. But velo kashya, it's still not a question. Let's explain. Kan b'shogeg, kan b'mezid. When are you allowed to bring your hand back in? When you accidentally put your hand outside on Shabbat. When are you not allowed to bring your hand back in? When you did it intentionally. You did it intentionally, the Chachamim are hard on you. They say you did it b'kavanah, you're not allowed to bring your hand back in. You did it b'shogeg, you're allowed to bring your hand back in. Now there's a major Rashi here, I'm going to try to speak this out clearly, who explains pretty much what Yochai was just saying. Because one could argue, it's still a proof to Rav Bibi Bar Abaye. We said b'shogeg, what's the halacha? You could bring your hand back in. So that should prove to us that where you put the bread in the oven b'shogeg, what should be the halacha?
You should pull him out.
Take it off. So he says, listen good. Rashi, we don't have so much time. I would love to go through this Rashi, but everyone has to run. So Rashi explains like this. You can't bring a proof. Why can't you bring a proof?
If everyone
wants to look at Rashi, the bottom Rashi of the page, it's kedai to see this because Rashi explains beautifully. B'shogeg lo kansur Rabbanan. V'uderav Bibi Bar Abaye lo tipsha mehachat. Lo le'isur v'lo le'heter. You can't prove to the question of Rabbi Abaye not for isur, not for heter. Dahai de lo kansua b'shogeg is beautiful. Because the fact that we don't give a knas, you could bring your hand back in if you put it outside b'shogeg, lav mishum chashasha didilma shadilahu miadehu. It's not a problem you might put it down on the ground. Ela mishum de lo avad isura b'mezid. You didn't do an isur intentionally. V'chazarat yado eino afilu shvut. There's no isur to bring your hand back in. What's coming on, Chazal would come along and put a special isur on you. There's no isur right now. So since you did it b'shogeg, they're not going to put the isur on you in the first place. But in the case where you put the bread in the oven, unless there would be a penalty. And here they're not going to give you a penalty. But the rediata pat, removing the bread from the oven, is in and of itself and Yisur D'Rabbanan. So you can't bring a proof, says Rashi, from the fact that it would be mutar to bring your hand back in. That means they're not giving you a knas. But to remove the bread is an Yisur D'Rabbanan. So maybe there you wouldn't be allowed to remove it. And he goes the other way too. And he says exactly what Yochai, we can read it also if you want, but I'll just speak it outside. He speaks the other way also. Maybe he'll bring a proof from the other way. We said if he puts his hand out in Mesid, he can't bring his hand back in. So from that, maybe you should say that they're enforcing an Yisur D'Rabbanan Darabanan, even though it leads to an Isur D'Oraita, and you can't take the bread off the oven. So Rashi says it's also not a proof. Exactly what Yochai said, because maybe you'll be able to hold it. So there they'll say you have to hold it the whole Shabbat and you can't. But in the case of Rediat Pat, where it's definitely going to lead 10 minutes, it's going to be big, that's an Isur D'Oraita, you can't bring a proof from the maybe. You are allowed to remove it then in the case. So you can't bring a proof, beautiful Rashi, you can't bring a proof from the new Ukimta, the new way we're explaining the two Braitaot, this third attempt, to the Shaila of Rabbi Bar.
So here there is no comparison because it's going to end up leading for cooking the bread, for sure.
Right.
And here in the hand, there is still a chance.
Exactly.
And if the person is strong enough to hold
it. It's not Vadai. Exactly. All right, we still have 2 more pirchot to go. Let's continue, Chevra. The last 2 are pretty easy. Let's see it. The 4th pircha, the Gemara says. Sorry, did I finish that? Kam shogeg kam mezid. B'shogeg lo kansur abanan. B'mezid kansur abanan. Fine. The 4th pircha means a 4th way to understand the 2 braitaot. Idi v'idi b'shogeg. Both cases are where he put his hand outside on Shabbat b'shogeg. V'hacha bekansu shogeg etu mezid kamifligi. So what's the machloket? If he put his hand out b'mezid, he would not be allowed to bring his hand back in. The she'ila is, the machloket is, do we give him a penalty b'shogeg based on the mezid case? This is brought sometimes in halacha is, since b'mezid something would be asur, so maybe we should even say b'shogeg it's asur, so that it's a gzeira that you don't ultimately lead to a case of mezid. There's a concept of konsin shogeg etu mezid. If something is asur, you're chayav b'mezid, and someone does it b'shogeg, do we extend the isur to shogeg so that in the future it shouldn't lead to a case of mezid? So both agree that be'etz and b'shogeg should be mutar. B'mezid, you wouldn't be allowed to bring your hand back in. The question is, do we extend the gezeirah from mezid to shogeg as well, because we don't want you to ultimately lead to cases of mezid. So the braita that says asur lachzira says konsim shogeg etu mezid, meaning we say if it's asur b'mezid, we want to also make it asur b'shogeg. The second braita mudar lachzira says we don't make such a gezeirah. Fine. Mar savar kansu shogeg etu mezid, or mar savar lo kansu shogeg etu mezid. Fine. The final answer. This is a fascinating answer too. Leolam lo kansu. Really, we're talking. Both agree we would not make a penalty. Means we would say is if you put your hand out b'shogeg, you should be allowed to bring it back in. The question is, which chatzer are you bringing your hand back into? So we were always assuming you have Reshut HaYachid and Reshut HaRabim, and he's picking it up in Yachid, he put his hand outside. Oh, so hold on. When you're bringing your hand back in, you want to put it back down. Are you putting it back into your chatzer or into somebody else's chatzer? This is going to be an afkamina. Why is it an afkamina? I'll just explain it outside and we'll see it inside. The reason it's an afkamina is like this. If you're bringing it back into your chatzer, so essentially your intention was to remove it from your domain. That's what you were trying to do. If you bring it back into your domain, your chatzer, your courtyard, you haven't accomplished anything that you're trying to do. But if you put it into somebody else's chatzer, you haven't accomplished what you originally wanted to, which was to put it in Reshut HaRabim. But you have accomplished a little bit that it's not in your chatzer anymore. So the Chachamim say like this: when you're putting it back into your Reshut, it's mutar, because you're not accomplishing anything that you were ultimately trying to do. But to put it into someone else's chatzer, it's a little bit of a success in what you were trying to do, which was to get it out of your chatzer, and that's going to be asur. Let's read that inside. Velo kashya, kan lo ta chatzer. This that we say you're allowed to bring it back in mutar lachzira. The second braita is into your own courtyard. Turning to Dalim Amud Aleph, kan lechatzer acheret. When it's asur lachzira, means to put it into someone else's courtyard. Kideba minei Rav Amir Rav Nachman. Like we find Rav asked Rav Nachman a similar question. If somebody's hand was full of fruits and he put it outside, you let it bring it back into your own chatzer. Nachman said mutar. What about the chatzer acheret? Rav asked Rav Nachman, what about to a different person's chatzer? He said it's prohibited. So Rav said, what's the difference? How do you understand it? So Rav Nachman responded, Rashi learns this is bedichuta, that he responded in a way of like a joke. He said, so there's 2 ways Rashi learns this. Either it means when you measure out a kur of salt, or it means when you eat a kur of salt, the difference is so obvious, basically. He says like this: Hatam lo itavida machashavto. When you bring it back into your own courtyard, you haven't accomplished your original intention, because you didn't put it outside and it's back in your own space. Hacha, but in the case when you put it in someone else's, itavida machshavto, you've accomplished a little bit of what you were trying to do, and that would therefore be asur. You wouldn't be allowed to put it into chatzer acheret. But bottom line is, we've shown we don't answer directly the question of Abaye, which was if it's considered a karmilit or not, because we said either both right hold it is karmilit, it's not karmilit, and then we explained 5 different ways of understanding the machloket. All right, we'll stop at the top of Dalet Amud Aleph. Tomorrow,
one question.